particularly Joseph's life and Jacob's life as they were intertwined together. And then we were going to move on from there to the book of Exodus. And one of the things I pointed out to you was that if you go back to the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, so what we have is Genesis chapter 50 and then Exodus chapter 1. For most people in their Bibles, it's a matter of turning one page. But what many don't realize is in turning that page, we've covered the time that the children of Israel, Jacob and his family, went down to Egypt. And now we're at the point where they're coming back, or the preparation for them to get out of Egypt and to come back to inherit the promised land. And there is 400 years of history almost contained in the crack between the two pages because there's no record of it. I mean, we're told that they were down in Egypt, but we know that they were going to be there for 400 years. Now, how would you know that they're going to be there for 400 years? Well, the Bible tells us. Look to Acts chapter 7. Stephen starts off his account of the history by speaking about Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran. And he said to him, verse 3, "Leave your country and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you." Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his brothers died, God removed him into this country in which you are now living. But he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. And yet, even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his descendants after him. But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be aliens in a foreign land and that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. And whatever nation to which they will be in bondage, I myself will judge, said God. And after that, they will come out and serve me in this place. Now, there already was preparation for them going down to Egypt, which they didn't know about at the time. And that was when the brothers of Joseph sold him into slavery. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and he was sold, obviously in the slave market, to Potiphar, and worked in Potiphar's house, as we know, and was doing really well there. The Lord was blessing him and blessing the household. He was a steward for Potiphar, and he was a very faithful steward in all that was entrusted to him, even to the point that when Potiphar's wife made propositions to him, he told her, "Look, your master, my master has put, your husband, my master has put everything under my charge. There's nothing that's not under my charge." And he says he's withheld nothing, but I will not have any relationship with you. I couldn't sin against God and do a thing like that. So she made accusations against him. He goes to prison, and it seems like, having been sold by his brothers, been hated by his brothers being jealous and angry of him, he's now moved to being a slave. He thought he was getting back on his feet. Now he's thrown into prison again. I don't know, in Psalm 105, it talks about him being in chains. I don't know whether that was when he was first sold to Potiphar or when he was in prison, or maybe on both occasions. But he was in chains, and you can imagine how depressing it was for a young man. He had been 17 when this all started, and he's now a prisoner. Again, he's blessed by the Lord, because this man had learned a secret about life. One of the secrets is when things are falling apart, get busy. Get busy. Do what you know to be right. Do what you know to be good. Serve the Lord. Trust the Lord. Pray to the Lord. Do good to your fellow man. That's what we're here for. That's what we're supposed to be doing. You need to just do it. Don't sit around moping, God help me, look at how disastrous my life is, look at what God has put me through. There's nothing good coming at my way. It just seems that I'm going from one problem to another. And that sort of negative thinking is depressing, both for you and for everybody around you. It is certainly not consistent with the faith we're to have in God Almighty. And Joseph knew that. He got on with it. He was so successful that the jailer put him in charge of all the prisoners. And he was looking after their needs, a real servant of servants, this man. And he went about achieving a reputation even in the prison. So he got out of the prison, as we know the story about how he got out. And he came to interpret Pharaoh's dream, which he did. And Pharaoh was so impressed with his insight and his understanding, and no doubt with his personality, that he put him a second in charge in all of Egypt. Now, this was all going on unbeknownst to Jacob, because Jacob thought he was dead. The brothers had given him the very-coloured coat that he had on with blood on it, and they let Jacob come to his own conclusions as to where his son might be. It was a bad situation. What Joseph realized while he was down in Egypt was that his life, yes, looked from a worldly standpoint and a fleshly standpoint like it was a disaster. But when things turned for the good, and he got married and he had children, it seems like he settled down and he began to think about why he might be there, why these things all happened. And it was Joseph's conclusion, and he gives it to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for I am in God's place. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." He now saw things from God's perspective, not from his own. He saw that God's hand was in the whole episode of his life, from beginning to end. That God had used these terrible circumstances to bring about a greater good, which was the preservation of life, and in particular, the preservation of Jacob and the family, which meant the preservation of God's promises and the successful implementation of God's plan to choose Jacob and his sons as Israel. They would be the foundation of the nation of Israel. They would, from that point on, propagate into a great nation down in Egypt. Now, it was important in terms of the promises that God had made, that they understood that God's hand was in this move. So when Jacob came and was sending when Jacob saw the famine in the land, and he was sending his sons down to Egypt, and all these terrible things happened to them at the hands of Joseph, which they didn't realize it was Joseph, and the brothers being accused of spying, and the brothers being accused of stealing money and all of that thing. Some of them put in prison, all of them put in prison, and then one of them being left there. It was a very difficult time for the brothers. They began to realize, hey, look, what we did to Joseph in the past is all coming back on us now. Another great lesson for us all, that your sins will find you out. It might take 14, 15 years. You might think you've got away with it. You might have even forgotten about what you've done and what you haven't done. But your sins will find you out. And there's always a price to pay for the sins. Sins are not without wages. And the wages of sin is death. Before the death, there may be great suffering and great hardship and great stress in your life as a result of your own sins. We blame everybody else because that's the way we deflect from ourselves. It's very hard for us to accept what we are, what we've done. And yet that's exactly what we need to do if we're going to be anyway, or if we're going to have truth in the inner man in any way, shape or form. We've got to come to terms with, this is what I was. And sometimes the shame of, this is what I am and this is what I've done. And we very rarely connect in this day and age anything that we might be suffering now with anything that we did wrong in the past. Because we're not fixed on the idea that sin will be punished. We're not fixed on that idea. Even when God forgives us of our sins, the natural consequences of those sins might catch up with us. It doesn't take away the natural consequences. He'll forgive you, but you might have to endure the natural consequences. When David sinned, the natural consequences were that the sword would never leave his home, his household. And that continued on, even though God said, I forgive you. That continued on in the rebellion of Absalom and in all the other terrible things that happened near the end of his life. So you just have to be aware that, sin has consequences, and sin's consequences are not good, they're bad. They're bad, and they bring pain and sorrow. So Jacob hasn't moved yet, but now at the last stage he gets word that Joseph is down in Egypt and that he's asking him to come down and to live with him down there and be saved from the events that were taking place in the famine that was over the whole earth at that time, or at least that part of the world. So it's a wonderful thing to see that he comes to this understanding that his son is not dead but is alive. Can you imagine the impact of that information on him? The confusion that was in his mind. The very fact now that the brothers are going to have to explain what really happened. The coming to terms with that. The whole, what do we do now? He's saying, come down. Should I stay in the land? Should I go down to Egypt? All of that would have troubled him greatly. What he would have, I suppose, started to think was, well, look, the circumstances are such which would suggest that if I stay here, we might starve to death, especially if this goes on too long. And then the other circumstance that Joseph was alive, that he was there, a leader in Egypt, and that he could look after them, and he was asking them to come. That would have also indicated that maybe it is the best thing to do at this moment in time is to go down to Egypt and take the offer which he has given me. But also, he may have taken into account. Now you have to start understanding he's struggling with this. He's like the rest of us. He didn't know what to do or what not to do, but he's struggling with it. So he has to put two and two together. He has to decide where the circumstances are driving me, and say, is this the direction the Lord wants me to go? There may be other things, like he would remember the promise that was made to Abraham. and the explanation of in your seed, not in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, that will be, that in your descendants, that I will make of you a great nation, or I will give you this land and make of you a great nation. And then all the nations of the earth will be blessed in your seed. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 15. The promise had been made in chapter 12, but it comes to a head here when, after a long time, he has no children, and he believes that God is going to bless him in his descendants, but he has no children. So how is this possible? Again, here's a man struggling to believe what God has promised, because the circumstances are just not forthcoming in terms of that promise. So he offers Eliezer of Damascus, one of his servants, to be the heir. And it says in verse 5, God took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Then he believed in the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. All right, so here's this faith that he would have descendants now, that he would have children eventually, and that he would have descendants. He's still unsure. He had been brought up out of the Ur of the Chaldeans, and God would give him this land to possess it. And he asks in verse 8, he says, O Lord God, how may I know that I shall possess it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And he brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. All right, so here's this promise. Now Jacob must have known about this promise. And I wonder if he just, it didn't go through his mind, well, this is the way the Lord explains what's going to happen to his descendants. And I wondered if that influenced him then in saying, well, maybe it's the Lord's will that I just go down here. Well, one way or the other, he starts out on the journey. No doubt, still in some doubt as to whether he should go or not. But when he gets Genesis chapter 46, let's turn there. I did want to mention too that in Genesis 28, Jacob had left Israel already. Remember, he went up to Haran to get a wife and that. And the Lord was with him, and the Lord promised to be with him at that stage. So that may have fed into his decision to go. But he wasn't left without God backing him, or about to leave without God backing him up. So Israel set out with all that he had, and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifice to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And he said, I am the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. And I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. And they took their livestock and all the rest of it. There was about 72 people in all that went down to Egypt at this stage. But now Jacob had the confirmation. And I know you may be thinking in your head, I wish to God that could happen in my life, that the Lord would just speak to me. And of course there's some denominational people think he does speak directly to us. But we know we've just got to base our decisions on what our circumstances are and what the scriptures teach. And then we do need to pray to God about it. We need to ask him to give us wisdom, to give us understanding, to show us what way we should go. We should do all of that. And then based on all of that, we should make our decision. And hopefully it's to honor God and it's to glorify and progress his plan for us in this life and for others in this life as well. Okay, so he's got the reassurance now. And what I want to bring out of this is life seems to just unfold before us. I mean, it's just what happens next. We're here worshiping now. When we're finished, we'll all leave the building and go our separate ways, and maybe some will go out to eat, some will eat at home, some won't have anything to eat until later on. We all go our separate ways. But whatever our lives are and whatever we're about to do in our lives, some might even have to go to work even. But whatever it is, God's with us. And your life, he's using you and your life for his plan. He has a plan for your life. And if you submit and obey his will or to his will, you're going to find that plan can be unfolded and can be brought to fruition. It's when we try to resist or thwart God's plan that causes the problem. But one way or the other, God will override your resistance, or maybe just twist your arm a little bit and force you into doing what you need to do in order to bring about his will. So just take all of that into consideration. There's a natural development to life, which is the one that we see and the one we're a part of. There is a supernatural sovereignty governing our lives while all of this is happening. And we need to accept that God's in control of it all. And we need to accept that if he's promised what he has promised, that he will deliver me, that he will stand by me, that he will give me wisdom and understanding, that he will help me through the difficulties, and that the good which he has in his mind, Lord willing, will be predominant effect or goal which we will see sooner or later in our lives and in the lives of others. So, all right. So here now, he's been told he would make them into a great nation down in Egypt. Now, this is the way God used Egypt. All that development, all of that society, I mean, the most organized society in the ancient world. So many things that even in the present day, people look at or think about and admire about Egypt. And God was, in a most wonderful way, God was going to then, after they had developed into a great nation, and after learning so many of the things that they needed to learn in order to become a nation themselves, he would bring them out. He would bring them out and give them the land of Canaan as he had promised them. Just as a matter of interest, if we go to Exodus chapter 1, we're told in verse 7, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. This is how extensive the development of the nation of Israel had been in Egypt. It was a place that was big enough to contain that sort of development. It was because they've had Joseph in high office in the early stages, and they were no doubt respected because of Joseph, and the development started from there. They were very productive. Even before Jacob died, things were on the move, greatly on the move, and his spirit had been lifted. Joseph's spirit had been lifted. Everybody's spirit, the tide had come in, and all the boats were lifted as a result of what God had done here. And it started from there. So we're now into the stage of nearly the 400 years that had been predicted, and they were spreading out all over the place. So much so that Pharaoh began to fear them, because in his mind he thought, well, they're so extensive now that if anybody came to attack us, they could join with them and they could overthrow us here. So he decided that he would try and keep them in check by making them work at building and at farming and so forth. But in the building projects, he wanted them to put out quotas. He put his Egyptian taskmasters over them, and they were literally trying to work them to death, is what they were trying to do. Now this is a horrible period for them. Horrible. And you can well imagine if they had held faith in God, how they would feel about what was happening. Was God deserted us? After all this time, is he abandoned us? Is he not listening to our prayers? What's going on here? Again, we can't see the bigger picture. They did know, they did work, but they also continued to multiply. And it tells us in verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. It's really, really interesting that they would continue to multiply and be very fruitful in the land, even under these circumstances. But what we need to understand, affliction, especially on a nation or on a church or on a family, affliction tends to be the cement that brings us together, makes us closer, gives us strength, helps us to work together as a unit and appreciate the comfort of having others with you who share the same morals and the same faith and the same hopes. It's a wonderful thing. So the affliction can do that for us. So when it happens to us, I know it's painful, and I know there are times where we get depressed because if it gets anyway prolonged at all, we can't cope with or feel we can't cope with it. But God's not going to send you anything that you can't cope with. Everything is common to man, and he'll not send anything that you can't deal with. Of course, with his help. In and of yourself, you're not able to deal with it. But if he's with you and he's helping you, you can cope with it and you can overcome it. So they were having to trust now God. And no doubt there are times of worship together where they would sacrifice. the times when they would circumcise the children and get together and sing and pray, and all of those times were very dear to them because they felt a cohesion between brethren, and that they were of the one nation, and that they were God's people, and that they were given a promise by God that they would inherit a land of their own. So they had a great hope laid out before them. Since that wasn't working, Pharaoh increased the pressure by charging the midwives to kill every male child that was born. Now, they didn't carry out his command, and as we discussed, chances are they said to the women, don't call us till the last minute, don't call us at all if you can manage yourself. They probably all colluded in that, so that the midwives could say, look, these women are strong, they can give birth before midwife comes, and that's what's happening. So there's reasons for us not being able to get around to doing this sort of thing. Anyway, then he gives a general command involving the Egyptians as well. Any Hebrew child that was found was to be thrown into the Nile. And that was, he was just so mad, so irrational, so determined to solve this problem that he gave a command like that. And as was pointed out in the class, this was really irrational because he was killing off his workforce. But at the same time, he was leaving the girls there so that they could intermarry with the Egyptians, and maybe the Egyptians would become a bit stronger with these strong women and strong offspring, who knows. But anyway, the pressure was really on. And even in that pressure, Moses was born. Moses was protected for 3 months. And then when they could hold on to him no longer in the home, he was taken, put in an ark, a little wicker basket covered with pitch so that it would float, and put in the reeds beside the Nile. We know the story. Princess of Egypt, Pharaoh's daughter, came down, heard the child crying, opened it up, saw it was a Hebrew child. Her heart was melted by this little baby's, according to Stephen, who was beautiful before the Lord. Now, whether that was his character or that was his good looks, I don't know, maybe it was both. But anyway, she fell for the child. And then Miriam, Moses' sister, came up to her and says, will I get a woman to look after the child for you? So she said yes. So the mother takes the child and nurses the child, and is paid by Pharaoh's daughter to look after the child. And here was the redemption of Israel. Here was the one that was going to deliver Israel. But in the meantime, he was brought up in all of the learning and wisdom of the Egyptians. He knew how to run a nation. He knew what law was. He knew how to go about having a military campaign. He would have learned all sorts of things that were absolutely essential to Israel becoming a functioning nation in and of itself. It seems from the story, and we get just little hints, that the children of Israel learned. They moved out of just looking after the sheep and looking after the cattle. Over those 300 or 400 years, they spread out in Egypt, and they began to pick up other skills. I know that because when it came to building the tabernacle, Exodus chapter 38 here, they were already skilled 38, what is it? Maybe 36, hold on. Yeah, sorry, yeah, the end of 35 and the beginning of 36. Thanks very much. In verse 30, Moses said to the sons of Israel, "See, the Lord has called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and he has filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, and in knowledge, and in all craftsmanship, to make designs for working in gold, and in silver, and in bronze, and in the cutting of stones for settings, and in the carving of wood, so as to perform in every inventive work. He also had put in his heart to teach both he and Aholiab, the son of Ahishamach of the tribe of Dan, and he has filled them with skills to perform every work of an engraver and of a designer and of an embroiderer in blue and in purple and in scarlet material and fine linen, and of a weaver and as performers of every work and makers of designs." Now, this is very interesting because he does specify Aholiab and Bezalel, but there were others who had gifts that were brought in to work on crafting the whole tabernacle. We know there were others with skills from 1 Chronicles chapter 4. He was giving a list of descendants. And in verse 14 it says, Meonothai became the father of Ophrah, and Seraiah became the father of Joab, the father of Ge-Harashim, for they were craftsmen. Some say carpenters. But this seems to be a household or a trade guild of craftsmen. In 21, it says, the sons of Shelah, the son of Judah, were the father of Leka, and Leada, the father of Maresha, and the families of the house of the linen workers at Beth Ashabiah. And verse 23, and there were potters and inhabitants of Netanim and Gedara, and they lived there with the king for his work. So these are just little hints of the fact that as they spread out, they went into various trades and learned these skills and learned these trades. So they weren't just shepherds anymore. They were skilled tradesmen as well as shepherds. And they were learning all the skills that would be necessary for when they became a great nation of their own, so that they could put these skills to work for and on behalf of the people. Again, I want to bring to your attention the fact that whatever gifts and talents you've got, and we all have our different gifts and different talents, they're a gift from God. Now, you may, if you're a tradesman, have had to learn your trade from a journeyman. Do an apprenticeship. Years ago, this was more prevalent and it was more obvious as well. You did an apprenticeship, and after 3 or 4 years, you became a journeyman. You were accepted then as a fully fledged craftsman in that trade. But that seems to have gone by the wayside. I don't know why it has, because it was the right way to go. Anyway, the point about it is, even though we have to learn from other humans, God sees that we're with the right people, that we get the learning that we need to get to hone the gifts that He's given us, and that these gifts and these talents might be used for His glory and for the benefit of your fellow man. Now, one of the benefits is that you're able to provide for your own family. And if you don't do that, as a man, you're worse than an infidel. You are to provide for your own family. The person who was a thief, we're told in Ephesians chapter 4, is to steal no longer, but let him work with his hands so that he might be able to help those who are in need. Not only provide for his family, but to help other people who are needy. So we've got an obligation in using our skills to glorify God and to benefit our fellow man, not just ourselves. Too many people are using the God-given talents to build up their ego and their pride, to make them feel that they're superior to everybody else, to make them head and shoulders over everybody else, to make people admire them and look up to them, to give them power over other people. All of that is an abuse. It's the flesh. It's selfishness. We're servants of God and servants of each other. And that's the place that we should be as Christians, and that's the mindset we should have in working out the gifts and the talents that God has given us. But all of these things, can you see how God's hand is in it all? Can you see how life is moving, history is moving on, our lives are moving on, but they're not moving on without God. God has a plan for it. And as much as we think, what's going on in the world? Why is nation up against nation, and why this and why that? Even the nations are under God's control. And the leaders of those nations. That should give us some comfort and some hope in the terrible mess that is our history as human beings. All right. Psalm 33, I'm going to finish on this just to show you. In verse 10, it says of the Lord nullifies the counsel of the nations. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart from generation to generation. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. If we're to be considered, the Christians are to be considered a nation, and there's a sense in which we can be considered a nation, our citizenship is in heaven, we're the blessed people. He's chosen us for his own. We want to see his plans unfold. We want to cooperate with him in unfolding those plans by being submissive and obedient, by trusting him and knowing the power that is at his disposal, which he will use for our benefit and for our upbuilding and our glory, for that matter. These are things that we should learn from the events of Genesis and Exodus, and they are wonderful lessons. They're gems which will certainly help us to be more wise in the way that we live our lives for God on this earth. Leave it with you.